Good afternoon, everybody. I call to order the February 2026 Committee of the Finance and Operations Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. Thank you to those who are joining us via live stream, those who are here in the boardroom, and those who are joining us by Zoom. Let me welcome our student representative for today. I think we'll be joined by Aaron Maurer of the Morris campus, and we do have Ethan Ellis here from the Twin Cities campus. Welcome in. I think we're going to start today with fiscal year 2027 annual operating budget framework. Interim Vice President, Budget Director Corwin Zewerts will take us through the item, but I'll turn to you, Executive Vice President Goldman, first.
Thank you, Chair Wheeler and members of the committee. Before we dive into the details of the FY 2027 annual operating budget framework, I want to take a moment to ground our discussion in the context of the current fiscal year and the critical decisions the board made last June. When you approved the FY 2026 budget, you authorized a balanced plan that directly addressed significant headwinds, including reduced state funding, cuts to the federal investments, and rising inflation. That budget required a shared sacrifice across the system to ensure we could focus on our core mission. It's important to remind ourselves of the context we are operating in today. Unlike many of our peers, the university held a tight lid on tuition and compensation for over a decade, with average increases well below the rate of inflation. While those decisions were made with the best intention for affordability, it resulted in the university falling behind in the market. We're now in a period of moving forward from those decisions many years ago to continue to drive our financial requirements today. As we look forward to fiscal 2027 budget that you will be asked to approve in June, our primary cost and revenue drivers remain consistent: compensation and tuition. On the compensation front, our FY 26 investments were made with the aim to maintain that same momentum for the rest of the university this year. We must continue to invest in our faculty and our staff to remain competitive. In respect to tuition, we remain committed to accessibility, but we must balance that with the reality of our operational costs. This framework is our final committee-level discussion on these variables. It outlines how we'll use strategic reallocations and efficiency gains to fund our priorities, including work that is outlined in our strategic plan and our critical infrastructure needs. To walk us through these levers, I'm pleased to introduce Corwin Zewerts, our Interim Vice President and Budget Director. Corwin?
Thank you, Executive Vice President Goldman. And so we'll continue our discussion today on the university's budget with an overview of the university's budget framework and more detailed data for the variables that make up that framework. This is our third conversation in a four-part series that began back in October. As you may recall, we started with a conversation on the university's budget model, a model that helps us translate financial challenges and opportunities down to our various budgeting units, the Resource Responsibility Centers, or commonly known as the RRCs. At that meeting, we also presented an overview of the university's annual budget process. Then, in December, we followed with a discussion on the primary revenue and expenditure variables that drive the budget each year, essentially the building blocks for the annual budget framework. We spent much of our time in December on the trends and the current status of those variables. Today, I'm here to present more detailed estimates for those revenue and expense variables and to discuss how the two come together to make up the budget framework. This will also be an opportunity for a broader conversation on priorities, opportunities, and challenges as we continue to think through those priorities all through the spring. Our discussion on the operating budget will then conclude in June with a presentation of President Cunningham's recommended fiscal year 27 operating budget for your review and action. We will begin our discussion today by talking through how the budget framework fits into the normal budgeting process, and then we'll move on to the revenue and expense estimates. And finally, we'll talk through how we balance those variables to create a balanced budget. As we talk through the major revenue and expense drivers today, you will find that we focus most of our attention on tuition and state-funded portions of our budget, as those are the major revenue sources that are planned at the institutional level. They are highlighted here in a darker green as they represent our most flexible resources. With that said, we'll present an all-funds budget to you in June, a budget including all of our resources. I have mentioned the budget framework now several times, so before we jump into the details and the numbers, I wanted to show you a pictorial view of the framework. Essentially, the budget framework assesses the available resources, primarily tuition and state appropriations, and balance those against costs and investments. In the end, the available resources must be greater than or equal to the costs and investments. We use the budget framework methodology throughout the full budget development cycle, which occurs every 2 years, beginning in the even-numbered year. The cycle begins with the development of a 2-year budget framework in which we are looking at revenue and expense variables and making some broad assumptions at the 30,000-foot level. This provides the backdrop for the university's biennial budget request to the state. During that same time period, we also used the budget framework to help build the university's operating budget. We revised the framework several times throughout the course of the year as we get more information on resources and expenses. The first year of the cycle concluded last June. And we began the second year of the cycle last July. Since the state's biennial budget process had concluded and the board had passed the 26 budget, we used that data to craft a revised budget framework, a new 30,000-foot look at the university's budget. As of today, we're about halfway through the second year of the budget development cycle. Throughout the entire 2-year cycle, we are updating the balance between revenues and expenses, or the budget framework. This is a highly iterative process and ensures we bring you a balanced budget in June, concluding the 2-year cycle. To help show how we have put together the budget in the past, I will walk through the 2026 budget framework. This will give you a sense of how the pieces need to come together to create a balanced budget. But before I jump into the detailed numbers, there are a few important notes. The budget framework is based on recurring revenues and recurring expenses, and we work incrementally. This helps to ensure we have enough resources to cover our long-term costs. Also, we are primarily focusing on the state O&M and tuition funds, as those sources are planned at the institutional level. I will begin with the resources. You will see they totaled approximately $206 million for the 2026 operating budget. On the first line, you'll notice that the appropriation for core mission is noted as 0. This is because we did not receive additional funds from the state last year. Therefore, there were no additional new incremental resources from the state to cover additional costs. Moving down, you can see that the 26 budget relied on $92 million in reallocations. Reallocations are commonly used to balance the budget, and they play a more prominent role when the university does not receive an increase in state funding. Tuition was budgeted to increase $71.8 million. This was due to 2 tuition variables, both changes in tuition rates across all 5 of our campuses, as well as projected changes in enrollment. The fiscal year 26 budget also incorporated other unit revenues. This was primarily tuition above budget in fiscal year 25. Finally, the budget relied on units balances as a temporary bridge. These individual items added up to the $206 million of available incremental resources. These resources were then allocated to fund $198.8 million in new incremental recurring expenses, beginning with an investment in our talented workforce. Compensation increases in the 2026 budget totaled $59 million. In addition, you can see a few lines down, we held $15 million for a workforce development fund, an investment in our future. The university also invested in programs, student aid, facilities, technology, core operations, and services. These investments totaled $107 million. We also set aside $15 million in funding for the strategic plan. And lastly, the budget also acknowledged that several units had tuition coming in under budget for fiscal '25. The incremental resources less the incremental expenses left us with a balance of $7.3 million coming into fiscal year 2027. A strategic decision given the headwinds we are feeling today. Through the budgeting process, this framework is then translated into a corresponding all-funds budget plan. This plan is approved by the board. The framework funds are highlighted here in yellow, making up 36% of the total all-funds budget, including internal sales. It is with this context in mind that I will now pivot to the development of the 2027 operating budget framework. Over the course of the next few months, we will need to make decisions on what we should plan for in both resources and expenses. You can see some of the variables listed here. We will need to think through our assumptions for state appropriations. We also need to decide which we should plan for in tuition and enrollment, potential growth in other resources, as well as reallocations. On the expense side, we will need to determine our compensation strategy, cover the cost increases due to changes in our fringe rates, pay for must-do cost increases, and then determine investments in strategic and programmatic priorities. I will begin today on the expenditure side of the framework. From an expense perspective, there are several significant cost drivers that will need to be funded in order to maintain our current level of activity. The first increase is related to the university's fringe benefit rates. Fringe benefit costs are expected to increase by $25.2 million in fiscal year '27, a must-do item in our budget. This is a new required cost due to a significant increase in most of our fringe rates. All of our rates are increasing, but some very significantly. As an example, the fringe rates used for academic faculty and P&A employees is going up by 1.9 percentage points, and the non-academic rate is increasing by 2.6 percentage points, and so on. These increases are based on actual fiscal year '25 costs due to medical claims and pharmacy benefits. Those are the two most significant drivers. The second major cost driver is compensation. Compensation will increase by $5.1 million due to our current labor contracts, and then each 0.5% increase in non-labor salaries will cost an additional $6.6 million system-wide. From a facilities and capital perspective, we have at least $3.6 million in required costs based on current estimates. This is for increases in debt, utilities, leases, and so forth. Operating costs are expected to increase as well. We have $2 million in inflationary costs for technology license and maintenance agreements alone. We'll also need to consider other inflationary adjustments, increases related to supplies, equipment, compliance, safety, and so on. In addition to the required investments I just mentioned, the university also makes strategic investments through the budget each year. Strategic investments cover a broad array of costs. Sometimes these investments are exciting new things, such as expansion of programs, new services for students, advancing our enrollment strategies, and so on. Other times the investments are more about maintaining what we have, such as investments in our core operations or facilities, providing support to units that are struggling with structural imbalances, addressing compliance and safety needs, data security, and so forth. This category is a true mix. It is not only the fun and exciting things, these are also investments to maintain what we have today. Each year, we have a long list of potential investment opportunities in each of the university's missions and across all of our units. At the same time, we are consistently constrained by our available resources. To balance the budget framework, we primarily rely on state funding, tuition, and reallocations. As I mentioned earlier, our state funds are not growing. As this chart shows, our state funding has been relatively stable to decreasing since fiscal year 2024. There are no new state dollars to invest in next year's budget either. We did hold the $7.3 million from the 26 budget that I showed earlier. That was a strategic decision to help in fiscal year 27. The other major revenue source is tuition. With no additional state funding for fiscal year 27 and increasing costs, there are additional pressures on tuition to help balance the budget. When thinking about tuition, there are really two key variables. The first variable is a change in the tuition rates. We have provided a few examples here so that you can see the revenue generated given an increase for each student group. As an example, a 1% increase in resident undergraduate tuition for students on the Twin Cities campus would yield approximately $4.4 million in additional revenue. That number is scalable with a 3% increase totaling $3.2 million. For Twin Cities non-resident undergraduate students, a 1% increase would generate $1.7 million. And across all greater Minnesota campuses, a 1% increase in tuition would generate $1.3 million. All of these increases are high-level estimates at this point in the budget process, as we will begin meeting with the academic units in early March and will refine these estimates through the spring. In addition to rates, changes in enrollment will also impact our revenues. We can work to increase enrollment, which can help grow our tuition. This includes both increasing the number of students across our system, as well as changes to our enrollment mix. Rebuilding and expanding our non-resident, non-reciprocity enrollment as an example. But enrollment changes are hard and require investment. We know they're not automatic. As we are thinking through these two variables, both changes to the tuition rates as well as our enrollment and enrollment mix, there are many key factors that we need to consider, such as the impact to students and their families, market conditions and potential for enrollment growth, our other funding sources, as well as inflation. The list here is not exhaustive, but rather illustrative. In addition to tuition and state funding, the university has also relied on reallocations to balance its budget. Reallocations are when a unit reduces expenses in order to use those freed up resources to pay for new costs such as compensation increases. As you can see, each year we have used reallocations as a tool to help balance our budget. The reallocation levels have varied from year to year, given the other framework variables: tuition increases, the availability of new state funding, changes to compensation, inflation, investments, and so forth. All of the revenue and expense variables then come together in the budget framework to create a balanced budget for the upcoming fiscal year. As costs increase, we need to balance those increases with revenue. We have talked through many variables today, and this slide brings all of the preliminary estimates together into one place. You will see the incremental resource variables on the left and the incremental expense variables on the right. We've included a few scenarios for tuition. These are illustrative examples to spur discussion today and are high level due to where we're at within the process. These match the estimates you saw earlier in the presentation. You also see 3 examples for internal reallocation scenarios. As you may recall, we typically implement reallocations based on unit-specific circumstances. Reallocations are rarely implemented across the board. The reallocation estimates are meant to give you a general sense of the magnitude of various scenarios. From a state funding perspective, we're not anticipating any additional state funds in fiscal year 27. However, you can see under the FY26 Reserved Recurring Resources section, we strategically held the $7.3 million in funding last year to help with this year's budget. From a cost perspective, we have included 3 compensation scenarios as well. In each of these 3 scenarios, there are 2 constants. The first, if you can see on the top line under compensation, is the fringe increase with no salary increase at $25.2 million. And the second is given due to the labor contracts. There is a $5.1 million increase for the salary increases for labor represented employees. These 2 items combined total $30.3 million expense in the budget framework and are noted in the first column as must-dos. We have also provided 2 additional data points, one that shows the cost of a 1% increase for non-labor represented employees. This totals approximately $13.2 million, and another scenario with a 3.5% increase to mirror the labor represented rate. As a reminder, these examples, they're just examples for today to begin our thinking. Below, you will see the other costs we have started to discuss. We have at least $3.6 million in facilities and capital expenses that we must fund this year, as well as $2 million in technology license and maintenance agreements. As I noted earlier, we're only halfway through the current budget process, so these estimates may increase as we move through the spring. We will also need to account for additional costs to maintain our current support and academic functions, and there are always new investments that are important to the university and its 3 missions, some of which I noted earlier. In the end, the resources on the left will need to be scaled to cover any cost increases associated with the items on the right to come to a balanced budget framework. Although a budget framework relies on simple addition and subtraction to balance, the decisions to arrive at the budget framework are very challenging, especially in a year like 2027, when we are anticipating no increases in state funding, coupled with significant increases in costs. I will close my comments today on this slide by asking for your thoughts and input on these variables, and I'm also happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much. Before we do the discussion, I want to remind the committee that we're going to vote on the final budget in June. So this is a time to raise your questions, where this budget and its parameters that Vice President Zewers, Interim Vice President, has spoken to us about. So with that, I'll open it for discussion. President Cunningham, do you have, or Regent Turner first?
Right. I know it says we're not going to depend on the state for anything, but, the scuttlebutt in the hallway, from government relations is we may try to at least go for a bonding bill kind of thing. Is that reflected in here at all? And hopefully we have a really aggressive plan to just beat the doors down there of the state capitol to get that.
Regent Turner, the plan is to have a significant push around our capital request. The governor at this point has, in his proposals, around 75 million for HEAPR. The other 2 top priorities for us, which was the St. Paul Campus Center, as well as the dentistry school renovation, which will be talked about a little bit during the Health Committee today, were not part of the governor's priorities, but certainly our VP for Government Relations, Aaron Sexton, and others will be burning through shoe leather to try to see what success we can get during the session that's coming. I'm sure President Cunningham has comments on that as well.
Yeah, I think that sums up when we say there's no additional money, remembering it's a biennial budget. So, right, if we got no increase last year, then we get the best we can hope for is no increase this year, where there's always the risk of getting less still remains, right? So last year, if you remember, we worked really hard to not be cut. And this year we will again work really hard to maintain that flat funding, but with that we won't have the additional resources. So if I can just give a couple other high level thoughts for folks to think about is that slide a couple back where we talked about the reallocations, that one. So partly because we had no additional funding last year from the state and a flat budget, and we wanted to give the workforce reinvestment of the 3.5% to 4% merit, and we didn't want to raise tuition even more than we did last year. In order to do both of those things, we had to have this reallocation, which is then, as we heard from faculty and chairs and deans, is a 7% scope reallocation across their units that they had to do, right? And that provided then the fund that allowed us to do the merit and not raise tuition even more. So when we, as Corinne very beautifully went through all these different pieces, if we go maybe one more slide, Corinne, this one. So, the big levers that we generally will be talking about here, because after the budget for folks, for returning folks know, so this budget at this high level will get approved, and then we provide that instruction out to the schools, and then the schools make their own decisions. We're not setting the budget here by line or for the individual schools or programs. We're setting the budget at the high level, right? So the kinds of conversations that we wind up having as we get closer to the spring here, this year we already know we're not going to get more state funding. I mean, we'll keep trying, but are, how much we're going to raise tuition. And with that, how much merit we're going to give for compensation, as those are, if you see here, the two largest issues that we have to deal with. It's impossible to, and we've talked in the past here about workforce compensation and where we want to be and how to keep our workforce competitive, which is why we felt it was so important to do merit last year. It's impossible to do merit for our workforce, which is the largest single expense we have, without also raising tuition. And then there's other things that are in here as well that we can talk about, but I just want folks to think about, I think as we talked about it, as I made calls sort of around the budget last year, I mean, these are sort of the decisions. If we're going to do both of those things, the budget doesn't work on the back end. Even if we took out, gutted everything else, we couldn't make the place run. So.
Regent Bergstrom.
Thank you, Chair Wheeler, and thank you, Executive Vice President Goldman, and to your team. Question, and I'm forgetting the term that you all put on it, but I believe it was last year's budget, the board approved these, I think it was $10,000 a year to essentially help us leverage money outside, like more debt and all that, in terms of if we had to go these projects alone or whatever. If we're successful, after Regent Turner's wonderful phrasing of being aggressively getting after these, if they were funded, including dentistry in St. Paul Student Center, does that then save us some money on, do we have to use less of that money in that year, or is that kind of, or do we still have to do that? How does that work?
Regent Bergstrom, I wish that were the case. We still have to. So the $150 million that was a borrowing that was funded from the $10 million reoccurring in last year's budget is really the bubble gum and baling wire holding the rest of the university together. So this is the roofs and the elevators. It is also food nutrition in St. Paul. So the state last year through HEPR did fund phase one. As we know, in our world, phase two's never happened in our lifetime. So we were able to use the first part of that $150 million of bonding to do phase two of the CFAN's Food Science Nutrition Building. So unfortunately, it's not, we need both. We need the state to do their part, and we need to continue this program. President Cunningham.
Yeah, Chair Wheeler and Regent. Bergstrom, thank you. Yeah, so we have an $8 billion backlog of maintenance over the next decade. And where we sort of came to as a board, and last year what Greg very creatively brought with much appreciation is we can no longer simply expect that $8 billion backlog is going to be made up by the state. We have to, in the past, we didn't have money in our operating budget to appropriately begin to even address that. So we can no longer simply say that's going to be fixed somewhere else because we have, buildings that are crumbling and not modern to meet our needs. And so this is certainly part of our strategic plan. I always will quote the number, and priority number 5 includes our infrastructure. And we're committed to making improvements in that infrastructure for modern learning and modern research. And with that, we have to continue to set aside that $10 million. I don't remember if it's 5 a year or 10 a year. VP Goldman will 5 a year to be able to do that. And that allows us to bond for the money to be able to begin to just not have continued regress in those other ways, and to begin to chip away at some of these other things that have to be done. And then in addition to that, we very much continue to ask for major components that serve the state, certainly like the St. Paul Campus Center, or the only dental school in the state, which we'll talk about later on today. So historically, we didn't put that money aside, and that allowed us to not, for example, raise tuition as much. You can only do that for so many decades. Between then, we're asking students to pay tuition and not have a modern classroom. So we can't do that anymore.
Thank you. Regent Goldberg-Luger.
Thank you, Chair Wheeler. Thank you, Executive VP Goldman, and your excellent presentation. Really appreciate that. I know tuition is always challenging for students and families and for Regents' decision-making. I'm curious, and I probably should know this, but do we have a range that we look to be against our competitors? So, Big Ten, we want to be in the middle of the pack on tuition, or wherever we aim to be. Where are we, and who we look at, the Big Ten? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
Chair Wheeler, Regent Luger, we do, and what we will come with is kind of that comparison as others start to make those decisions. So kind of the middle-ish is where we want to be. We need to remember on an inflation-adjusted basis, our tuition today is less than it was 10 years ago, and certainly pay attention to those things as well. So we will look at Big Ten comparisons. We'll look at where we lose students to. Something at some point that, not for today, the reciprocity is something with Wisconsin and others that I think at some point as a board, as a state, we're going to need to look at just as we try to manage our tuition flow. Clearly, Vice President Sneed, with the work of Provost Ritter, looking at non-residents and others. So kind of all in, we try to be in that range. And certainly when we come with our formal proposal, we'll have those comparisons to look at.
If I may add, Chair Wheeler and Regent Luger, we always have to remember too, when we raise tuition, that we are protecting the most vulnerable students. First of all, there's the North Star Promise, so those students will not feel those increases. And then we have quite generous financial aid. So really in that category of family income under about $120,000 will not feel these increases in the same way. So tuition increases are felt predominantly by our students that doesn't mean they're not painful, but not in that most vulnerable category.
Okay, thank you. Regent Hipsch.
Thank you, Chair Wheeler. Thanks for the presentation. And, that your predecessor and now you make this very easy for us. You get it down to one sheet, which is, I know more than one sheet in your computer, right? But so here's the deal. Nobody likes raising tuition. It sucks, everybody knows that. Nobody doesn't like to raise wages because inflation rates are real. And so we're kind of forced to do both. I mean, we have to keep the tuition at the inflation rate, which is about 2.8% or 3%. And so that's where I'm at. And on the compensation, I mean, we can't have the best workforce and pay the lowest wages. Pick one, right? And so I would like to go all in, and I think the reallocation is very necessary at the 5%. I think we have to go in there hard, and we need to always be looking for new sources of revenue, but we have to get this new strategic plan a chance to work, and we tackle things like the enrollment plan, and we're trying to get our campus enrollment up, in spite of the fact that there's less students really in the nation and the world and state. So unfortunately, I don't like the tuition increases. I don't like giving 0% wages, but I don't think we see a lot of choice. And hopefully we can start chipping away at this. But like Vice President Goldman said, we're still under inflation. And if you look at this from when I was going to school there, which is a long time ago, but the state provided about 62% of the funding, and now it's about, what is it, 12? 14%, yeah. So, so we're asking, as a society, we've asked students to take on more, and we haven't funded it. And so, unfortunately, this is like the last 5 budgets I've been involved in, it's gonna be very similar. And I don't know the way out of it, so that's all I'm gonna say. Thank you for your work. Yeah.
Thank you, Regent Hipsch. Regent Mohammed.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the snapshot. I think we're just in a national conundrum, right, just economically when it comes to both workforce and really making sure that higher education institutions like ours can sustain themselves. But I am trying to think about what is a multi-pronged or a multi-phase approach, right? Are there some doors that we can be knocking on? Is there folks that we're partnering up with within or across the enterprise to really figure out what other type of sponsorship models might look like, and really to be able to allow us to have some ability of cushion, right? I think a lot of our industry partners are also struggling right now, but I think if we can start thinking about what is a 3-month, 6-month, 9-month, 12-month strategy, right? And really start making some clear asks. Maybe I'm assuming some things are already happening there, but I think it is really hard to stomach, tuition rates rising, right? Knowing that a lot of our working families and even families who may be able to potentially afford it are not sure what the next 3 years might look like for them from an economic aspect, right? And so we are one of the largest employers of the state, and so we are also having to think about that as well. But yeah, it's a conundrum, it's an issue, but just trying to think about what can we do.
Thank you. Regent Turner.
Yeah, thank you. I just had one more question about when we go up to the Capitol this coming Tuesday, correct? Is when session starts? Yeah, it does. It does. I checked. All right, so in anticipation of the proverbial, you need to cut administrative costs, I take it we are going to make a big to-do about how we told everyone to make a 7%.
Yeah, Regent
Because I
Turner,
can hear it
Chair
right
Verheugen,
now.
Chair Wheeler. So last year, we made we did our part last year. And if you remind me, the tuition increase last year was
6.5.
6.5%. We are very much working to try to not channel 6.5. I don't know what will happen in the world between now and then, so VP Goldman will slap me if I commit. However, the hope is certainly that we're not in that realm again this year. But if we look at wanting to raise in the 5th largest workforce of the state, raise real salaries, which also help our families, then raising tuition will be important. We are channeling, that's what's down here on the bottom, reallocations, not at the 7% level. And you do recall that was a complicated that was a big change a lot of schools made last year, and we heard about those programs that were all precious that needed to be pulled back from them. So this year we are not asking them to model that much. We're asking them to model lower amounts. Which of those amounts we have to pick partly depends on where we're going to go with these other pieces, right? So so does that help? I mean, but I think what you can say at the state, Regent Turner, is we are making scope reductions again this year that will work here to try to reallocate and reprioritize and be good stewards of those funds for our workforce. Yeah.
Right. I know we're doing the work. What I'm saying, are we going to make a big deal about it up there, letting them know that we have made significant.
Yeah.
Each school has gone through and made some very painful cuts.
We should.
And I want that to be broadcasted to the world up there, because otherwise we just keep hearing, well, don't raise tuition, but cut all that administrative costs, et cetera.
Yeah. Right.
That's what I'm saying.
Right. I hear you. The administrative units will also make reallocations in the same way. So all of the units across the university will be making cuts and prioritizing, again, hopefully not to the degree that they had to do last year. But with that, we're also hoping to not have to raise tuition as much this year. Right. But, I think I'll just say, although Greg may, again, send me evil looks, I would not look at that 1% column too much, because in order to do that, this group would have to really decide to make difficult choices on the labor side and on doing anything else. So, that's there as a marker of what each 1% of tuition will be. but you'd have to understand the decisions you'd be making in order to only raise tuition 1% would be quite tremendous on the other side.
Maybe, thank you very much, President Cunningham. I'll make one last comment that I just didn't hear from others. But, we've talked about the investments that are needed and the very, very difficult choices that are going to be needed to fund those investments. We talked about AI Hub today. We talked about the infrastructure needed for enrollment pieces. And we talk about workforce reinvestment. And on that score, I will say I think we're talking about the entire workforce. So it's very difficult to, just as we've fallen behind on capital reinvestments, it would be very difficult to fall behind on part of our workforce without thinking about the whole. So I'm thinking my input would be that last column, although it's a $36 million delta from the must-do in the first column. I think that's something to be highly considered. Yeah. Student Representative Ellis.
Thank you so much, Chair Wheeler. Vice President Zuer, thank you so much for this presentation. I have a question about the last two line items on the tuition increases. So graduate students and professional students are lumped in together here, despite the fact that the funding mechanisms for those two groups of students are extremely different. Knowing that graduate students are largely funded by their units or by faculty-attached external funding, I was wondering how you model that in these numbers and whether or not this is just going to put more pressure on the units to make sure these tuition increases are met.
Chair Wheeler and members, with the graduate and professional student increases, we work with all of the colleges and the campuses on their tuition estimates. And for the professional programs, the adjustments to the tuition rates are primarily based on market adjustments. We work with them specifically on that to make sure that they're not out of line with their peers and competitors. On the graduate side, even though the rates are set more based on the graduate school rate, the programs have the ability to make adjustments in terms of their enrollment, so that is not being driven centrally.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, everybody. All right, well, we'll need to move on to our next thing, but thank you, Interim Vice President Zuer. I really appreciate your work.
Thank you.
All right, next item will focus on governance framework related to the university's central reserves funds. Today's discussion is going to help inform potential amendments to our board policies in this areas. And walking us through this item will be Vice President Michael Volna and Associate Vice President Andrew Parks. And I will again turn to Executive Vice President Goldman to set this item up.
Great. Thank you, Chair Wheeler and members of the committee. Our next item is a discussion on the university reserves structure. The board policy on central reserves and investment of reserves are currently under comprehensive review. This provides an opportunity for us to step back and evaluate our overall reserve and liquidity framework to ensure the university is positioned to respond efficiently and effectively to periods of financial stress or unexpected disruption. Historically, board policy has focused on central reserves in a relatively narrow and segmented way. Recent economic volatility and external uncertainties underscore the importance of viewing reserves and liquidity through a broader, enterprise-wide lens. In response, the administration is proposing a more integrated framework for reserves and liquidity management. This approach reflects the full range of assets that contribute to the university's financial resilience and organizes them within a three-tiered structure based on accessibility and return profiles. Importantly, this is not a change in our fiscal philosophy or financial discipline. It is a formalization of practices already embedded in how we manage liquidity and long-term assets. The proposed framework aligns with investment and treasury best practices and supports the use of widely recognized liquidity metrics, including those considered by rating agencies. It also reflects the board's direction to move more policies away from transactional detail and towards governance, strategy, and risk management. Today's discussion is informational. We welcome your input before returning in April with proposed policy revisions for formal consideration. Joining me are Mike Volna, Vice President and Assistant CFO, and Andrew Parks, Associate Vice President and Chief Investment Officer. I'll turn it over to VP Volna to begin. Mike?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Wheeler, members of the board, and EVP Goldman. Before I move the slide, I want to give a tip of the hat to Julie Tonneson. Even in retirement, she has an impact. She contributed mightily to this, and I assured her she would get a cut of the royalties we get out of this. Today, as EVP Goldman mentioned, today we are going to talk about a new way that we'd like to think about board policy related to reserves. During the conversation, we'll provide a brief overview of the current board policy framework. We'll talk about some foundational principles to guide revisions to policy and introduce the proposed new framework. We'd like to spend a significant amount of time dedicated to explaining this three-tiered framework of financial assets that represent how we have historically thought about and utilized reserves. We will wrap up with some potential implications if you are supportive of our developing board policy revisions under this framework. Just to give you a little bit of historical context, we really started the conversations last summer and came to this concept late summer. We spent 2 or 3 months in the fall and early winter in consultation. As EVP Goldman said, today is a discussion to introduce it and get your feedback on it. If it goes well and if you're comfortable with this approach, we'll come back in April with draft policy for review, and then we would come back in June for approval. While this slide may look like the shock and awe portion of the presentation, we actually included it to make a very important point. When you look at these headlines, the point is reserves are essential. They serve several valuable purposes to the university. First, they provide a buffer for normal business and cash flow cycles. They represent resources for unplanned opportunities, both programmatic and physical. And they serve as emergency funds for significant negative unplanned financial shocks, such as the headlines on this slide. Not only are they essential for university operations, adequacy of reserves is an expectation of rating agencies, investors who buy our bonds, and even state and other governmental agencies as support from them becomes harder to get. I do want to reemphasize what EVP Goldman said up front. This really is not a fundamental change in policy or practice as we think of it. It really is an alignment of policy with how we have always viewed the reserves and operated with reserves. So in that sense, it really is a formalization of a framework that was already implicit. As we began this policy review process last summer, the recent events that we've all seen and been a part of highlighted the need to be prepared for potential economic shocks to the university. As I noted, the university has navigated many economic shocks over the years. We have been successful because we have had a wide range of financial tools and reserves to help create solutions. We are proposing a new enterprise-wide framework that is broader than current board policy, which really focuses on a narrow concept of central reserves. Capital adequacy and liquidity management are key concepts embedded in this new framework. The idea of a broader view that includes the full mosaic of financial tools and assets available to the university is a key distinguishing point from the current framework. Finally, under this framework, consolidation of the two current but separate board policies, central reserves and investment of reserves, would simplify and align all aspects of board governance for reserves in one policy. Now I'd just like to give you a brief thumbnail on the two policies that actually are available in current board policy. The two, as I said, are central reserves and investment of reserves. With respect to central reserves, The policy primarily defines the purpose, sources, and uses for central reserves. Metrics used in the policy are generally revenue-based rather than the more industry standard use of expense-based metrics. On the right side, the investment of reserves provides guidance on the objectives, levels, acceptable investment types, and other guidelines for the investment of the assets that compose university reserves. I should note that there is a separate policy related to the endowment, so that is not part of what we call reserves. In this investment of reserves policy, it also contains a series of revenue-based metrics. We wanted to put this slide up because it might look familiar to some of you. Before I talk in depth about some of the details, I want to reiterate the notion of what are reserves. Reserves are really institutional resources that provide flexibility for financial events such as operational cash flow needs. What do I mean by that? Well, think about tuition. We essentially get tuition twice a year in 2 big chunks. In between those points, we have to have ways to have cash available. Reserves provide opportunities for strategic, unplanned events such as real estate acquisitions. And the example I'll use is right across the street. The board recently looked into acquiring Station 19. And finally, reserves provide a buffer for significant, unexpected negative financial shocks, such as those that were on the previous slide. If I now turn to the actual slide and show and look at the table that's on the right side, this may look familiar to some of you, as it's an example of the information presented to you regarding reserves. This table is actually what we have developed in response to what is required in board policy. It's focused really on a series of unrestricted budget accounts that make up central reserves. The true reserve component is the balance in these accounts after applicable revenues are added to the accounts and expenditures are deducted from the accounts. So it's really the little number in the lower right-hand corner, 89.9. Since this is the FY25 budget for central reserves, what this really says is that for FY25, we plan for 89.9 in reserves in these accounts. To put that in perspective, 89.9 million for FY25 was less than 3% of the annual operating budget, or roughly less than 1 week of expenditures. So the key takeaways here are the current policy definition of reserves is very narrow and siloed in that the focus is only on these central reserve accounts. And the actual reserve amounts correlating to this policy are relatively insignificant in comparison to the total annual budget of the university. So now to talk about the new framework, I'm going to turn it over to CIO Parks.
Thanks, Mike, and good afternoon to everyone. So building on Mike's overview of the central reserves policy, I'll first walk through the investment of reserves policy. So this policy addresses both the short-term and long-term reserve pools, which we refer to as the temporary investment pool, or TIP, and the group income pool, or GIP, respectively. Now, given the short-term reserves represent over 95% of the capital that's governed by this policy, I'll center my comments there. So at a high level, as Mike alluded to, the policy really addresses 2 issues. The first is the floor for how much should be in that pool at any point in time, and the second relates to the investment objectives and the constraints that direct how the pool should be invested. So regarding the first issue, there are a handful of different financial and operating metrics that are referenced in the policy, which when taken together establish that minimum floor of capital. And it's equivalent to approximately 2.5 months worth of our annual operating budget, or to use a common industry metric, it's about 69 days cash on hand. And that's there primarily to ensure that we have sufficient liquidity to meet the short-term funding and operational needs of the university. Because in a perfect world, the revenue inflows would always match the timing of our expenditure outflows, but in the real world, that's rarely the case. So we need to maintain excess liquidity buffers to ensure financial stability, and that's really the primary purpose of this pool. It reminds me of an adage that I think is somewhat apropos in this context, which is to never forget the 6-foot-tall man who drowned crossing the stream that was on average 5 feet deep. So we don't manage our liquidity posture with the averages in mind. We have to manage for the troughs, for the extreme scenarios, to ensure that we have the clearance to survive when the depth hits 10 feet in that proverbial stream, not just 5. Now, switching to the second issue, this policy addresses the investment objectives and constraints. So there's an inherent trade-off that we have to manage between liquidity and return. Holding excessive levels of cash ensures liquidity, but it sacrifices return potential that's available to us by investing that cash in the markets. So in simpleton's English, basically what the policy does in terms of setting out our priorities is it says, first, focus on liquidity, make sure that we can have ready access to that capital. Second, capital preservation, so don't lose money. Third, total return. While we're busy not losing money, try to make as much money as possible while still maintaining or still operating within the appropriate risk guardrails. So how does the policy suggest that we do that? First, it basically implies we implement a sort of a barbell strategy whereby we invest on one end in very safe and liquid short-term government securities like treasury bills, and then on the other end, we have the ability to invest up to 30% into higher risk, but also higher expected return strategies that are available to us in the private credit markets and in the endowment. So assuming we come back to you all in April as planned, we may talk some more about technical revisions to the investment policy related language, but for now, the relevant takeaway that I just wanted to mention is that the pool exists primarily to ensure capital availability and secondarily to generate incremental return. So these two policies, the central reserves and investment reserves policies, really collectively represent the status quo with respect to how we think about and manage reserves and liquidity at the institution. Now let's talk about where we envision going from here. So there are a few guiding principles that underpin much of what we're talking about today. The first is that in theory, we have a handful of distinct pools of capital serving distinct purposes, and their sources and uses of capital need not interplay. And that works fine in peacetime, but in practice, if we're in a wartime scenario, we would look at all of them holistically in developing a solution. So creating a governance framework around reserves and liquidity that's enterprise-wide is more pragmatic, it's more flexible, it's more strategic, and it better positions us to optimize funding sources and uses. The second guiding principle is that you improve resilience when you can avoid being forced to do something you don't want to do. And so examples of that would be tapping into the external debt markets when interest rates are prohibitively high or our credit outlook is challenged. Another example would be tapping internal reserves if the markets have just sold off. So ideally, we want a diversified mix of both internal and external sources of capital that help us maintain optionality. Third, all things equal, we would rather draw first from pools of capital that are easily accessible and low cost. And lastly, too little in financial resources can trigger liquidity pressures and amplify vulnerability in turbulent times, while too much in excess reserves results in unproductive capital. Now, I recognize that the latter is probably unlikely to be the problem we'll face in this financial and budgetary environment, but the concept is that we're trying to find a sort of Goldilocks spot along that continuum. Now, with that first guiding principle in mind of widening out the aperture and looking at the university's asset mosaic more holistically, we thought that a personal finance analog would help to contextualize this issue. So most individuals and households have checking accounts to manage everyday liquidity needs, savings accounts for a down payment on a home or a dream vacation, 401ks and IRAs for retirement, insurance, mortgages and credit cards with banks, and if we're homeowners, equity in our homes or other personal property. And in a similar fashion, the university maintains multiple financial accounts, each of which are tailored to specific needs, timeframes, and degrees of financial impact. So as I mentioned, we have TIP, the temporary investment pool, which really acts as the checking account for everyday liquidity needs, and in which the rainy day fund or central reserves is also housed. GIP for medium-term departmental savings, SEF, or the Consolidated Endowment Fund, as a perpetual endowment for long-term growth. And these are supplemented by our captive insurance company, which is referred to as Rominco, for insurance needs, short and longer-term strategic debt programs, and a portfolio of what in accounting speak are referred to as capital assets, ranging from monetizable land, so think Umore Park, to much less monetizable core campus infrastructure. So sticking with this analog, an individual facing a financial shock would presumably look at and leverage their entire financial toolkit, depending on the severity of the crisis. So that might be taking a penalty and drawing from retirement accounts. It could be going to the bank and getting a loan. It could be selling their prized baseball card collection. But the point is they're going to look at that full mosaic. And so we think that the university should manage its resources with that same holistic perspective. And this enterprise-wide framework that we're proposing really allows us to do that rather than limiting our scope to just the 20% of capital that is captured in the current framework. Now, with that in mind, and to get a bit more practical, the capital in each of these pools of money have varying degrees of accessibility. And importantly, those degrees of accessibility can vary not just across pools, but within pools as well. So as Julie Tonneson used to remind everyone, and as Corinne highlighted in the previous session when she reviewed the revenue sources by category, not all money is green. So if we aggregate up across each of the pools of capital all of the unencumbered money that can be used for general purposes, that would represent just less than a quarter of the university's total financial and capital assets. Now, why is that? Mainly because much of it is bespoke. So endowments have to be utilized in line with donor intent. Grant dollars have to be used aligned with specific research projects. Bond proceeds historically have been used to only fund capital projects, not operating needs, et cetera. So there would be low to moderate frictions involved in accessing about half of the capital, the green and the yellow portions, while the remaining half, the red, has low levels of accessibility. Therefore, while we have a lot of tools in the toolkit, we have to first look at and understand our ability to tap into those resources before we can then assess whether we have the willingness to do so. And the next page provides a window into how we plan to incorporate both the concepts of ability and willingness into the framework. So again, what we're proposing involves thinking about capital adequacy and liquidity management utilizing 3 tiers. And those 3 tiers would be distinguished by their attributes of sources and uses. So for sources, we're doing what we visually represented on the prior slide and segregating the various pools of capital by their degree of accessibility from high to low, but then also by their cost of capital from low to high. And in this context, cost of capital can be thought of as either the explicit cost of borrowing from the debt markets or the opportunity cost, meaning the foregone earnings associated with tapping into and potentially exhausting internal reserves. So in this framework, we'd align lower cost of capital resources with Tier 1 and higher cost of capital resources with Tier 3, because all things equal, it's better to issue lower cost debt than higher cost debt. It's better to pull capital from an operating pool that has an opportunity cost of 3% than the endowment, which has an opportunity cost of 8%. So think of accessibility of capital as a proxy for ability and cost of capital as a proxy for willingness. Now, for uses, we utilize 2 factors as well. First being the likelihood or frequency of having to access the capital, so from high to low, and the magnitude of the capital requirement from low to high. So putting it all together, think of Tier 1 as covering those frequent and lower order of magnitude uses, leveraging highly liquid and low-cost capital, while Tier 3 covers the less frequent but higher order of magnitude uses with harder to access higher cost capital, and Tier 2 is in the middle. So in short, Tier 1 covers the everyday liquidity needs, Tier 2 covers the rainy or stormy day liquidity needs, and Tier 3 is basically the more draconian Armageddon-like scenarios. So next, let's look at how we were positioned at the end of FY25 vis-a-vis these 3 tiers. And to explain this might be a little juvenile, but remember back to when you were a kid or your kids were kids and you were playing with Legos, and think of each of the pools of capital from the 2 slides prior as towers that are built by green, yellow, and red sources of capital. And really what we're doing in quantifying how much capital we have in each of these tiers is we're simply pulling those towers apart and then putting all the green Legos together, that becomes Tier 1, putting all the yellow together, that's Tier 2, putting all the red together, that's Tier 3. And what we see is with all of the greens, we could cover about 1/3 of a year's worth of operating expenses, which for reference is more than the approximately 20% that we would need to cover per current policy. If we add all the yellows to the mix, we can get to about 3/4 of a year, and if we look at the reds, a little over 1.5 years. And so if you take away nothing else, I would say remember the header on this slide, which is that the good and bad news is that these asset levels signal modest strength, reflecting not a fortress balance sheet, but a structure that's designed for shock absorption. Because the reality of our current position is that our balance sheet would allow us to absorb the shock. So back to the adage I mentioned, to be able to wade across the the 10-foot depth portion of that stream. But then when we get to the other side, we would have to fundamentally realign the business model through budget or expenditure reductions. So I would say, taking a step back, at its core, this is really a monitoring and a reporting framework. It's not a procedures manual. So this is not intended to state exactly where we would go and what we would do in every conceivable financial scenario. It's simply a reserves and a liquidity dashboard of sorts that hopefully helps EVP Goldman, the president, you all as the board, to have a clear sense of the realities of our financial posture at any point in time and the trade-offs that we'd be faced with in addressing everything from very minor to major financial shocks. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Mike to wrap up and talk about the policy implications.
Thank you. So ultimately, you will want to have a bit of an understanding of both the model and what the implications are. And what we tried to do here is provide you just with a brief kind of early preview of how we would see board policy being affected by making this change. The existing policies would be consolidated into one policy. We think that's great because right now we really almost have two separate policies that if you're really sophisticated, you can put them together, but otherwise you might ask why one policy on reserves requires a week of operating, whereas the liquidity and asset investment of reserves model keeps us at 20%. So harmonizing them is a good thing. The policy would shift from a siloed, limited scope framework to a more enterprise-wide integrated approach. The objectives, though, would not change much at all. The metrics will likely shift to an expense basis, such as days cash on hand or percent of operating budget covered by reserves, as opposed to being targeted to revenues. We would also expect that the coverage metrics will likely increase, as I just noted. Currently, the reserve policy gets you to about a week's worth of spending, but the reality is we need much more than that. And there will likely be modifications to the investment policy related to the combining of the two policies and aligning them and so forth. So with that, we stand for questions and discussion. And thank you
Great.
for your time.
Thank you so much for this discussion. It's a really important presentation. While people are thinking about their comments and questions, I can't help but see you two there. And thank you too, because as chair and vice chair of the Finance Committee, James and I now, and Doug and I before that, chair the Investment Advisory Committee and the Debt Management Committee, of which these two lead, and do adeptly so with community and actually even nationwide experts volunteering on those things. It just speaks to the financial acumen and counsel that's received, and you lead those adeptly. So it's nice to be able to say that to you in this setting as well. So with that, I think this policy is part of almost our systemness work and goal in that. And I gotta say that Jason Langworthy really likes going from two policies to one. So there's that advantage too. But with that, I'll open it up for other questions.
Do we have an acronym for the policy, Jason?
Jason gets to co-design the acronym for the policy, right? Okay. All right. Any other questions about this?
I will just say I did have a proposal for an acronym, which was CALM, for Capital Adequacy and Liquidity Management, but I don't know if that'll win the day, but I thought it was.
We sure could use a dose of that in a lot of ways. Yeah. Regent Mohammed.
Just want to say like a huge kudos, right? Just like to be able to uncover these numbers and to be able to depict it in a way that's very clear for us. Really looking at the three tiers that are being introduced, I am wondering how we are faring amongst our other peer partners around assets that are available, right? Particularly those in the Big Ten, right? I think that number of 22%, I would like to see more green than red and yellow. And so, yeah, just wondering how common is it to be in this particular state?
Regent Wheeler, Regent Mohammed, actually, we do quite a bit of benchmarking on this. We don't necessarily do it around the Big Ten. Instead, what we do is we benchmark amongst other institutions that are similarly rated to us in the credit markets, which is a AA1 by Moody's. And when you look at some of our investments to expenses, cash to expense ratios and things like that, we are slightly above the median of the 13 or so schools that are rated AA1. So we compare favorably, but part of the reason for doing this is because it will get us to that point where we can compare where we're at in the policy and create metrics in the policy that are more industry standard.
That's great. Thank you. Student Representative Ellis. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair Wheeler. Forgive me if I nerd out on this for a little bit because I used to work in stress testing with the Federal Reserve. But this strikes me as being quite a similar concept, where the idea of this is to be, a rainy day fund. And so I'm curious, do you go through exercises of modeling those rainy days based on history and trying to see whether or not certain shocks might simultaneously affect different assets and the university?
Yeah, I will resist the urge. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, and Chair Wheeler, appreciate the opportunity to respond. So I'll resist the urge to geek out with you in describing some of the details, but in short, what I'll say is that the first thing we do, which is probably similar to what you focused on working for the Fed, is we think about assets and liabilities, and so we stress test the two of them independently, and then we think about them in concert, because sometimes they have some correlations. And I would say that the bulk of the work that we do is to focus on peak to trough declines in the operating pool. And as I said earlier about the adage of making it across the river, we use VAR metrics and look at basically 95th and 99th percentile scenarios from how much liquidity we have at its peak to how much we have at its trough. And it's relatively predictable in terms of the seasonality of it. As Mike mentioned, there are times when we have tuition come in and other types of flows that are very predictable, but there's $15 billion of gross cash flow that we manage throughout the year. There can be hundreds of millions of dollars of swings just within a given week. And so that is a core focus of our office, the Office of Investments and Banking, work on the Treasury front. And the short answer is yes, we spend a lot of time looking at left tail risks to make sure that we can make it across that river.
And how I would tie that then to the reserve piece of it is, while they're doing that, the budget office and the rest of the finance organization is evaluating what does it mean if the feds say they're going to cap F&A rates at 15%? What does it mean for our lost revenues? What does it mean if X, Y, or Z is going to happen? So he's stress testing what's available, and we're stress testing and evaluating what we might need.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Student Representative Ellison. I think you can see that these two gentlemen can geek out with the best of them. So, which I found to be true. Representative Goldberg-Luger.
Thank you, Chair Wheeler. What do we expect this change in policy would affect our credit rating at all?
No. No. If anything, it will align it more with, as I said, sort of the way rating agencies look at schools and look at institutions. I think it will be a good story to tell rating agencies that we've created a board-level policy that aligns nicely with and reinforces what they would be thinking about.
Regent Lugar, to add to that, I think if we look across the country, most will use days cash, not 3% of something. So, we're at and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, about 122-ish days of cash in that range. And there is benchmarking for that. The agencies care immensely about this. So I think it's going to show the agencies that we are modernizing in a way that will benefit as they do their work to help us do our work going forward.
Yes, President Cunningham.
I'll add in maybe two pieces. One, is a plea, I think that you'll maybe hear from me over time, that as we compare ourselves to the Big Ten, I'd also like us to increasingly think about that comparison group really is public AAU universities that are R1 institutions. So Big Ten is not the only comparison group and not often the equivalent comparison group for everything. So just, you'll hear that from me over time, so I'm gonna say that now. The other thing is, as we're talking about this in this lovely abstract way, and boy, I love your stream analogy, is really fabulous. There are many universities this year which suddenly found themselves with 6 months of no funds flow for a large chunk of their revenue. And we could think about how many that was, but that idea that all of a sudden people had to dip deeply into their reserves is very real in 2025 across higher ed. I don't know if the number was 10 institutions or 11, but it was a lot.
Yeah, I think it was 7 to 10 in that range. I know Northwestern was $50 million a month into their reserves in order to keep their operations going.
Because of the federal issues around research. And so it's not an abstract concept that suddenly we would have to manage changes in cash flow. And I know VP Goldman, thought about that in some other ways this year with, paper, cash, extension, et cetera. You can say that better than I can.
Commercial paper.
Right, and that's one of the reasons the board will remember last year you approved an increase to our commercial paper program, specifically just for that, having that extra layer of ability should we get that grenade over the fence, or should there be some other tangential thing that we're managing or dealing with.
Thank you.
I'll ask one more thing. I understand that we'll be looking at the combined policy in April and approve it in June. That said, how should the board, in an ongoing way, monitor this? I suspect some of the answer gets to be, and I would long for global metrics like days cash on hand, of which I'm familiar. I always say 3% of what? So I love that, but maybe that's part of the answer. But how can the board monitor this and make sure that we're having adequate reserves in this regard?
Great, thank you, Chair Wheeler. I think something that we can think about, and you and I have talked a little about, is what are some dashboards and other things that this committee could use from a governance standpoint to be able to track during the year. The approved budgets that you all do in June and how that's tracking during the year, along with some of these metrics. So my commitment to our chair as well as to the board is to think about that over the course of the spring and come up with something, working with our Chair Wheeler, to think what are those benchmarks, what are those dashboards, what are those things that from a governance standpoint the board can track some of these things. And I will look forward to working with you on that.
That's great. Look forward to it as well.
If I may just add, Regent Wheeler, so our office produces annually per board policy an annual asset management report, and Mike's office produces a similar report on the debt side. So we have had some initial discussions about figuring out ways where we could consolidate those and help paint that broader picture for the board. So we'd certainly welcome feedback and reactions to that as we work through things between now and April and June.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that helps us as a board not only know that we're doing the right things, but how will we know? And what do we look for? So thank you for that. Regent Bergstrom.
Thank you, Chair Wheeler. Relatedly, I think, Executive Vice President Goldman, I might be misremembering this, but as we embark on perhaps additional borrowing, which could somehow impact our credit rating, not necessarily in a terrible way, but how does that then interplay with the stress tests as well as kind of our benchmarking?
Chair Wheeler and Regent Bergstrom, what I would say is that we think about debt two ways. One is, in the more traditional sense, do we have the credit capacity within our current rating? But as anybody will tell you, it's not just do you have the capacity, but can you pay it back? And so we also think about what's the impact of debt structures, additional debt, and so forth on the operating budget. And that's part of the stress testing we do. When you approve capital projects every year, included in that is a sort of an assurance that we've started working with the units, and it's not on the list unless they can pay for it. So that's how we monitor and make sure that we protect our credit rating, is to make sure that what the board approves has already gone through enough of that evaluation.
Yeah, and Regent Bergstrom, to add to that, I think when we think about our credit rating, which is critical, the ability to pay back the debt just in the capital program just takes fortitude in our operating budget in being able to carve out those dollars for that over long term. I also think, and a lot of CFOs in my chair will look at a credit rating and say that's the most important thing in the world. When you actually look at the delta between what, AA1 might be and AA1 minus might be. It could be, 250 basis points. It could be 1/4%. And as we move this university forward with an ambitious strategic plan, we may come to this board at some point with a recommendation that it's okay to have a slight reduction of our credit rating in order to increase our capacity, because we have the fortitude to put into our budget around things that we want to do for buildings and other capital things. So expect a lot of discussion around this table as we start to find that sweet spot of certainly credit rating's important, but the ability to move the university forward is even more so if we do it in a thoughtful, calculated, careful way, as opposed to something that just happens randomly.
Great, thank you. Seeing no more questions, I'll just thank you again for the presentation, and quite frankly, all you do to allow us to reinvest in our people, in our facilities, and to keep the cost of education as low as possible. Thank you. We rely on that. Thank you very much. All right, next we'll consider the consent report. So Executive Vice President Goldman, I'll turn to you again to summarize that report.
Great. Thank you, Chair Wheeler and members of the committee. The Finance and Operations Consent Report is before you today for review and action. This month's report includes several items essential to our administrative and operational continuity. First, we are seeking approval for technical updates to our core retirement plans. These changes ensure compliance with Federal Secure Act 2.0 regarding Roth catch-up contributions and align withdrawal ages and rollover capabilities across our different plans. The next item is to seek approval to assign our existing debt advisory contract to Echo Financial Products due to a change of corporate ownership from the prior firm, Jenny Montgomery Scott. Because the university is planning a debt refinancing transaction in early 2026, it is critical that we maintain continuity with a specific advisory team. The assignment maintains our current contracts through June of 2026. Third, we seek approval to appoint Dr. Bonnie Keeler, Director of the Water Resource Center, as the university's representative to the State of Minnesota Clean Water Council. The next item is a new 3-year collective bargaining agreement with the Law Enforcement Labor Services Local 196. The agreement covers 71 law enforcement employees, including police officers and sergeants across the Duluth, Morris, and Twin Cities campuses. This new 3-year agreement, running through December 2028, provides structural wage increases, incorporates a statin adjustment reopener to ensure market competitiveness against regional departments, and increases shift differentials to better support employees working non-traditional hours. Next, the real estate item on the agenda is for a sale of 2.34-acre lot at 507 West College Street in Duluth to Minnesota Power for $120,000, which is the appraised value. This disposition is strategically beneficial as the buyer will use the site to install a high-voltage transformer to increase power reliability and capability for the UMD campus, with proceeds being reinvested into Duluth campus capital needs. Finally, we have 4 employment agreements for your consideration. First is for Tarek Tomes, who we have selected as our next Vice President and Chief Information Officer, effective March 16th of this year. Following a nationwide search, Tarek will join us from the state of Minnesota, where he served as commissioner and state CIO. Our IT infrastructure is a vital force in the university's mission, from supporting data-intensive research and innovation to enhancing the daily digital experience of our students, faculty, and staff. The CIO's role is critical to our collective success. Tarek is a highly respected technology leader with over 25 years of experience in both the public and private sectors. As a member of the governor's cabinet, he led the state's digital transformation, stabilized critical infrastructure, and championed and coordinated approach to cybersecurity. This experience navigating a complex matrix government environment makes him uniquely qualified to lead our IT community. He is committed to human-centered design and service-oriented leadership, and will be essential as we implement our strategic roadmap and addressing emerging opportunities in artificial intelligence and research innovation. We are thrilled to have him join our team. The remaining 3 agreements are for leadership positions within athletics at both Duluth and the Twin Cities campuses. These agreements extend current terms and provide market adjustments to ensure we retain the talent necessary to lead our programs and remain competitive. We have staff available to answer questions you may have regarding these items within the report. Thank you, Chair Wheeler.
Great, thank you so much. Before I invite a motion to approve the consent report, we're welcome to ask questions, make comments, or ask for an item to be separated out of the report to be voted on separately. I'm aware that one board member has to recuse themselves on the Duluth transaction item, real estate item, so I'm going to ask that that be pulled. And are there any other items that should be pulled from the consent report? If not, save for that one item, I'll ask for a motion to approve. So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, and any further discussion at all? All right, that approves all in favor? Say aye. Opposed? Okay, gosh, you got to kick me for those Robert's Rules violations. All right, so now we'll go back to the Duluth transaction of the sale of the property in Duluth. And we pulled that off because I know Regent Verhalen wants to recuse herself from that vote, so thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now a motion to approve? So moved. Second?
Second.
Any further discussion on that? All in favor? Aye. And opposed? No? Great, thank you. That is approved. All right. If there is no further discussion, I think wait, information items. I did it the same thing, Tad. Same thing. I'm following a good lead anyway, I gotta tell you that. All right, so I'll turn to you again, Executive Vice President Goldman.
Thank you, Chair Wheeler and members of the committee. Our final agenda item today is the Finance and Operations Information Report. Materials in the docket include the FY25 Annual Targeted Business and Community Economic Development and Small Business Programs Report, the Biomedical Sciences Research Facility Funding Report, which I'll note that through a $292 million partnership with the state, the program has created 422,000 square feet of research space in the Biomedical Discovery District, generating more than $343 million in research expenditures over the last 3 years. Your materials also include the Capital Appropriations Expenditures Report, providing an update to our stewardship of state investments. This report ensures transparency to the legislature by tracking financial status of every capital project, from major building renovations like Fraser Hall to the vital HEPA investments that maintain and advance our mission in critical facilities. And last, there is a report updating our collaboration with the state and federal government to remediate contaminated land in Rosemont, Minnesota. These reports are submitted in compliance with the board policy and status. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any comments or questions? All right. Seeing none and no additional business before the committee, we stand adjourned. Thank you very much. That's fun. We're all forgetting the last page.
I stay.